Hello, Universe, or any of its parallel realms, be they alternate timelines spawning from the same Big Bang or whatever else could result in a parallel reality. Yeah, I'm gonna assume you're not viewing this from a parallel reality. Pretty safe bet. But anyway, I'm here to talk about the Retro Freak. The Retro Freak by Cyber Gadget. It might quite possibly be the best device in retro video gaming ever developed. And, yeah. Well, its only weakness is, I wish it could play Atari cartridges. Maybe some Intellivision? Maybe a little ColecoVision? Alright, so I am going to unbox something. And although it says Amazon.co.jp, it's not from Amazon Japan. It's, I actually got it off of eBay, but it was new. It's just somebody that sells it. I used eBay as the place that I purchased it through. At least it's supposed to be brand new and packaged. What I got here, at least, maybe I'm wrong about what's in it. Or maybe they sent me the wrong item. Alright, so just gonna... Oops. So I'm opening this box. And I'm gonna set these to the side where we don't need to pay attention to those anymore. And the box is now open. Bubble wrap. And the box within the box. So we're partway there. Alright, now to find a place to set that for the moment. Nice plastic wrap to protect it from whatever. And we can take a closer look at the box later, but this is it, the Retro Freak. And let's see what's in there. It's not taped or anything. No, alright, I should be able to open this. Let's see what we have. Alright, we have instructions. And they're either Japanese or Chinese. I believe it was made in China and sold in Japan, if I'm correct about this. But it does have English language options in the system itself. And that just takes up space. This serves a purpose other than taking up space, I believe, by the weight behind it. You have an AC adapter. It appears to be Japanese style, which is good because that will be compatible with our North American electrical power systems. And of course, a controller. It's kind of reminiscent of a Super Nintendo controller, but not exactly, but similar. I prefer it when they rip off Sega Genesis controllers as opposed to ripping off Super Nintendo controllers, but either is good. And this appears to be HDMI, or is it USB? There's this. No, this is the USB one, and this is HDMI. And oh, this was important. I wanted this with it. This is a USB port over here, but everything else is various video game controller ports. On this side, I see Sega Genesis, which also works for just about anything Atari or old ColecoVision, but Sega Genesis style, Nintendo Entertainment System, and I believe PC Engine. And on the back here, Super Nintendo, and what one was that one? I actually don't immediately remember what the other one is, but almost reminds me of personal computer. Alright, and pop this off. Pop that off. We're almost all the way through to the final thing to be opened. And I'll just move that out of the way. And there it is, the Retro Freak. Slot for Game Boy, all the way up to Game Boy Advance, which is basically anything with Game Boy in the title. Some USB ports. A slot for PC Engine and TurboGrafx. An SD card can go in the back here, and I think that's where you plug in the power. And Another USB there, it looks like. That must be the HDMI, actually. Ah, the doors on this are not stupidly stiff. That's good. And let's see, I believe that'll be Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. Where's that one, Genesis? I think, no, that one reminds me of Nintendo Entertainment System, but it must be Famicom, because supposedly you need a converter to play Nintendo Entertainment System, and I already mentioned the stuff on the front. And the actual console itself, I believe, detaches from back here, that most of this is just for dealing with the cartridges. So I'll take a better look at that in the future. It says right on the back of this, RetroLink cartridge adapter by Cyber Gadget. RF2 made in China. RetroLink RF1 made in China. Cyber Gadget on the back there as well. And the biggest limitation for me is the fact that this is HDMI. And although I do have an HDMI television that works in the house here, the one that I used to use kind of died, and it was great because it had HDMI, it had component and composite, and even old style RF, and it worked pretty good with all of them, including NTSC and PAL, but that one died. And most of my televisions here are just traditional RF, and, well, AV cables actually, but anyway, I can work around that, and that's the device. Alright, so here I am to say what I have to say about the RetroLink. And I'm pretty impressed with it. I'm pretty happy with it. Yeah, I was playing with it on this television here. My regular video gaming televisions don't use HDMI. And, well, one of my televisions I played a lot of games on and watched a lot of television on recently died. I think it's probably repairable, but that's another story. So I borrowed this one here, which is actually the living room television, but anyway. Beside the point, rambling, talking about this device here. I was playing it a little bit over here, and it's great. This is great. This really is a good device. Nothing bad to say about it. I have, well, actually a few things to say about it, but that might improve with updates, since you can update it. I haven't yet bought an SD card specifically for this device. I mean, I could take one out of something else of mine somewhere here in the house, but I'm not going to. I'm going to buy an SD card specially for this, and with that you can use it to update it and also save games directly to it. The actual console itself, of course, is only this big, and that's kind of cool. I suppose if you don't need this and you have games stored directly on an SD card that's in this, then sure, plug in your USB controllers and HDMI cable, and that's a pretty simple device to take to a friend's place. Now, this, what can I say about it first off? Well, when I set it up, the first games I tried on it was my reproduction cartridge of Mega Man for the Sega Genesis and Crusader Centy, two Sega Genesis or Mega Drive games. And at first I had trouble getting them in. It's this top slot here for Sega Genesis, and I was worried maybe I was confusing the Famicom slot for the Mega Drive slot. Nope, I got the right slot. It was just a bit, it's just kind of hard to stuff it in, almost like the cartridge didn't want to line up perfectly with the pin connector inside of there. Almost as if the shape of the pin connector was almost too big to fit inside of the cartridge. The part that goes inside of the cartridge when the cartridge goes into the console. But it fit. It was just awkward to line it up right. And that was a bit surprising, because I'm used to plugging video game cartridges into a wide variety of video game systems. So that was a bit surprising, but manageable. And both of those games played excellent. The visuals looked right. The sound seemed correct. Hello, I'm going to load up a game. And powering up this system. It is a little weird that the power button's on the back. Alright. Let's see this thing come to life. There we go. See, it loads the cartridge, or all the data from the cartridge, right to the game system. And I'm going to use this controller here, because I think this is the best way to play this game. And I'm just going to plain and simple start playing. And it remembered where I was last time. Which is good if you have a game that has a faulty save game. This game is a little awkward, I find. That was good. And I tried the original controller that comes with this, as well as my USB Sega Saturn style controller from RetroLink, which is a really good controller. One particular controller that's really good with the system, I like this. It's the RetroLink Sega Saturn style controller. RetroLink is basically the same company as RetroBit. And it's a pretty good controller. Works great with this system. And let's see, what does it register it as? One of the great things about this controller is it has a really good D-pad like the Sega Saturn and Sega Genesis. Really good action buttons like the Sega Genesis or the Sega Saturn. And shoulder buttons like the Super Nintendo or the Sega Saturn. And this can be a very useful controller. It does feel a slight bit stiffer than the original Sega Genesis or Sega Saturn controller. So in very, very touchy games, you might prefer an original controller like the Sega Genesis controller. But otherwise, this is probably one of the best controllers you could get for playing retro video games. Now, the RetroLink controller, I find it's a little bit stiff compared to the original controller. And considering how touchy the controls in any Mega Man game are, it gives you kind of a stiff feeling to begin with. I figured, right there and then I decided, I'm going to test the controller adapter and use the original Sega Genesis 6-button controller with this thing. And I hooked it up. This original 6-button Sega Genesis controller works great with it. A lot of different control options for button mapping, and you can remap the buttons yourself. You'll have to map your own sort of like your hotkey button combinations, which is no problem. I kind of like the idea of going for a combination of mode button plus the start button. What to say about that, but the Sega Genesis 6-button controller worked great with this. Alright, so here's the Retro Freak turned on with no video game installed whatsoever, and I don't have an SD card, but let's see, controllers, and let's see, we're just taking a look at controllers. I'm sure it knows what controller I'm using right now. Oh, it's on PC Engine, whatever. You know what, I'm gonna go back into Game Boy Advance, and alright, and it detects, yeah, it knows that this is a Genesis controller. Yep, that's what I've got. The Sega Genesis. Like an electronic big bang, it bursts to life with some simulated reality. I don't know, I'm just thinking of a silly way to metaphorically describe Sega Genesis, because Genesis basically means generate. Well, they have both words have the same root. You know, Genesis is actually taken from Christian mythology, but anyway, back to this. Alright, let's take a look at, I don't want to reset the button mapping, I just want to, alright, let's what it's got. I'll just go out of that. I'll go into button mapping. Alright. Now, let's see. It was the only controller I tested with the controller adapter. But I did have one problem. After I had tried those games, I moved on to a Game Boy Advance game. And I used the Sega Genesis controller for the Game Boy Advance game. Looked at the default settings for the controller, just glanced at them, thought they were great. Then I realized, yeah, this is a fair bit counterintuitive. So I attempted to remap the controls. I looked at some of the other default options that they had. Like there was like the default setting, and then there were 2 preset settings. There, I wanted for Game Boy Advance. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Alright, I want the Genesis. Let's see, L and R. Using the Genesis pad. 6 button. Okay, yeah. So I don't want C and Z to be those buttons. Anyway, the default settings seemed good, but when I actually used them, when I actually looked at them closer, wasn't quite what I wanted. But you can map your own controls somehow. When you set up your, be it hotkeys or controller options, what you do is you select the button to change the option, then you get a 5-second countdown. You hold down the button you want to use. And that didn't seem to work when I was trying to remap. And I even created my own preset controls. I forget the term in the system for it, but your own controller mapping options. You can create your own profile, controller profile, or something like that. I created my own one, went in and tried to change what it, by default it gives you the default settings for you to change, and when I went in to change it, every button was already mapped. I didn't want turbo, and 2 of the buttons were already mapped to turbo. And every time I tried to change a button to another button, that button was already selected, and it wouldn't let me swap the buttons for some reason. Except for one time it did. One time it let me, and another time it wouldn't let me do this. It let me swap the mode button for a different button, just trying to see what buttons I could switch around. And it was really frustrating, but I got nowhere trying to reprogram the controls to use the Sega Genesis 6-button controller for the Game Boy Advance games. Now I'm going to go... Yeah, I'm going to go to this profile here. No, wait. Why didn't it select that? Is it changing at all when I change it? Okay, yeah, it is. Alright. So I'm going to go with this, because that's one that a profile I created myself. But the Sega Genesis controller has more buttons than the Game Boy Advance, but by default they decided to set up 2 of the buttons as turbo buttons, and since they were already selected as turbo, every button was already selected and I just couldn't switch them around. That was frustrating, and maybe if you update the software it improves that problem, because that was really screwed up. Alright, now let's see if I want to change. Alright, I want the A button. Am I happy with that being C? Yes. Am I happy with that being B? Yeah, I'm content with that. Alright, let's see if I can get... let's see if I can change that from X to Y. Alright, so I'm holding down Y, and it didn't change. As far as I can tell, it's because this is still selected as... I wonder if I were to try and change that to X, if it would swap them. Nope. Why can't I do that? But that said, I picked one of the default settings that I felt was the best, because they were pretty good default settings. I just wanted the L and R buttons, the left and right buttons, to be positioned left and right from each other, not above and below each other. But whatever, I found a good enough setting, and I set the controller up and played. And you know what? This played Game Boy Advance games really good. No complaints on how it played them. And if I was using a different controller, I probably would have had the exact mapping that I had wanted. It's just a matter of what controller you're using. I just wanted to use the Sega Genesis controller with that game. And I could, and one of the default settings did work very good. So played Genesis games, great. Played the Game Boy Advance games, great. I moved on to the Famicom slot and grabbed my Famicom game. I had the 31-in-1, and I figured I'd test that, see how it responds to that. It says there's an error, the cartridge might need to be cleaned or something like that, but I was thinking it might just be a problem because it's a multi-cart. And it loaded up Ice Climber. Yeah, that creepy game with the two fuckers that go around bashing seals with mallets. I know, the official North American release, they censored that because it's kind of disgusting to go around, you know, bashing seals upside the head with a mallet. But that was the original Japanese version. That's the version of it I was the most familiar with over the years. Because when I first played the game, that's the version of the game I played. I thought, yeah, those guys are kind of repulsive. I never really cared that much for Ice Climber or their seal bashing ways, but yeah. Ice Climber loaded up. It played fine, played great. It didn't load up the menu screen though, so I didn't get the menu screen to select games. It just picked one game, however the cartridge was made. That was the game that loads up by default when you plug it into this thing, and every time I tried to load up a game, it was always Ice Climber. Maybe if I tried again, maybe next time I would have got Pac-Man instead, or Mario Brothers, or some other game that's on the cartridge. Don't know, but that's what happened when I plugged that game into this. I don't yet have a converter to play Nintendo Entertainment System games on this, but I already have enough ways to play Nintendo Entertainment System games. And it's worth mentioning, although it only played one of the games from the 31-in-1, it was a lot easier to load that one game up on this system than trying to get the 31-in-1 to work in the actual Nintendo Entertainment System, because it's just one of those cartridges that is really stubborn, and the system really gets freaked out a lot when you try to play it. It basically ended up resetting it and taking the cartridge out and putting it back in, readjusting its position a lot before that one works. The Nintendo Entertainment System was always a frustrating system to get working. And for I never tried any PC Engine games. I don't have any yet, though I plan to add some to my collection fairly soon. Now, for Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, I'd already spent a lot of time playing around with the system, so the only game that I really got around trying at the time I had this set up to the television here, which was not that long ago, just a few nights ago, was the Japanese version of Cybernator, Assault Suit Valken. Sometimes I get confused. I'm pretty sure that one is Assault Suit Valken. Assault Suit Lenos is the Mega Drive version. Anyway, yeah, Assault Suit Valken. Anyway, the Japanese version of Cybernator. I plugged that into this, played great, but let's just load the game up. Do I want to continue? Why not? And for that one I actually used the controller that comes with this. This controller, with the trigger buttons in the position they are, is an excellent option for playing Cybernator, or as it's known in Japan, Assault Suit Valken, which this is the Japanese version. I have both the English and the Japanese version, and it's an impressive controller. It actually feels even better than a Super Nintendo controller, much to my surprise, because despite the fact it's not perfectly shaped like a Super Nintendo controller, it still feels in your hands like a Super Nintendo controller, which makes it a little bit better than the classic controller that was available for the Wii and the Wii U. If you remember that, it's like a rip-off of the Super Nintendo controller, but doesn't feel quite as good. This controller that comes with this feels as good as a Super Nintendo controller in your hands, but the buttons actually feel a little bit better, impressively. And yeah, the Super Nintendo controller is one that you want for Cybernator, or its Japanese equivalent. It just is because of the way the buttons are positioned. Though you could actually remap the Sega Genesis controller in a way that would work just as well. Maybe even better, because the Genesis controller has an even better feel to it, and the buttons are closer and more intuitively positioned on the Genesis controller. But that said, the controls for it by default are set up perfect for the Super Nintendo controller. That's generally the controller you're going to want. And thus I actually, because it was arranged like a Super Nintendo controller, that was the game that I really spent a fair bit of time testing the original controller that comes with this. And yeah, it's a great controller that comes with this. I'm going to test these games a bit more in the future, but yeah, it gets a lot of emulators still to this day can't do Sega Genesis and Sega Mega Drive sound correctly. This thing does. It gets those games right, and every other game that I tried on it, be it Famicom or Game Boy Advance or Super Famicom, which is the same as Super Nintendo, it got that right. And I'm going to mention the style of this thing. Look at this. Now, a lot of people kind of, I've seen some criticism for it that, though it's not a big issue for them, they said that it kind of isn't very stylish. It just kind of is such a simple look. I really like the style of this. I love how this thing looks. Mainly because it reminds me of an old school disk drive. It's been a long time since I played Commodore 64, not counting a plug-and-play version of the Commodore 64 that I have, but I loved Commodore 64. A friend of mine had an old Amiga computer. He had an old Amiga computer during the 16-bit era, as well as a Super Nintendo. Meanwhile, I had a Sega Genesis and a Sega CD, and together we had the best games of the era. Yeah, but yeah, I think of like old disk drives, and if you see old, be it PC computers, the IBM compatible ones that usually ran Windows, or Macintosh computers, or Apple computers from the time period of the 90s and so forth, you probably remember seeing like old CD drives and floppy drives, and yeah, or even, yeah, the computers from the 80s with the big floppy drives. Any of those usually look something like this. Like, it just reminds me of an old school disk drive, and I fucking love that. I think that's great. What I really wish they would do is come up with an alternate version of this that you could take the actual console itself out and plug into that worked with CD discs. Or maybe even floppy disks. Because this is an emulation device, I would love to see it upgraded, or a future version of it that could work with CD games, and be it Sega CD, PC Engine CD. Those are some old school consoles that had great CD games. Yeah, I really wish this could play Sega CD and PC Engine CD, and thus also TurboGrafx CD. That would be awesome. Or even old 80s computers and 90s computers. That would be great. I would love that. That would be awesome. But right now, this is pretty impressive. I mean, it could use an Atari 2600 slot. That would be pretty cool. Maybe an Atari 7800 slot, because that thing was backwards compatible with Atari 2600 anyway. Sure, I could think of things that add to it. It has some great controller options, even though I did have a little bit of problem trying to remap doing some remapping for Game Boy Advance. I had a great time using this original Sega Genesis controller with the system, and I was thinking eventually I'll try some of my other video game controllers with it as well too. Comes with a good controller, works great with other USB controllers such as the RetroLink Sega Saturn style USB controller. All around, it's a real good device. I don't know what else to say other than I do recommend it. I really enjoyed playing it, playing games on it. It did a good job with every game I put in it. So, I recommend it. I recommend the Retro Freak. And I definitely plan to take a more in-depth look at it in the future. I definitely plan to get the adapter to play Sega Mark III, as well as Sega SG-1000 and Sega Game Gear games.
Okay, by the time I got around to editing this video, I had recorded something else to be added to this video.
Okay, since I originally recorded the video talking about the Retro Freak, I got something. Yes. It's a PC Engine game. Alright, are you ready to play Spiral Wave for the PC Engine with a Sega Saturn style USB controller? I know I am. Oh, I gotta confirm the hotkey configuration for this. Alright. Oh, that's what I want. Alright, so on this USB controller I have set the left and right triggers as well as the start button as the hotkey menu. Alright, so now I'm ready to play the game. And it remembers that I played this game before and left off at the game over screen.
We now return you to the content originally recorded for this video.
But anyway, I think it's a really great device, and I hope to talk about it more in the future. And yeah, that's all I can say about it. I recommend it. If you have the chance to get this device, and if you don't think it's too expensive, I say go for it. It's great. It does what it says it does, and it does it really well. And that's pretty cool, actually. And plus, if you have old save cartridges, or I shouldn't say old save cartridges, if you have old cartridges with save games in them, you can copy the save games to the system, especially if you have an SD card. I think that makes it a lot easier. And why would that be a good idea? Because those old cartridges use an internal memory battery, and that battery can deteriorate with age, and yeah, you might lose your old save games. So here's a chance to back up your old save games, which is probably a pretty good idea. So anyway, not much left for me to say about it other than I'm impressed. I recommend it. I think it might just be the very best device ever in retro video gaming.
Okay, this video has pretty much come to an end, but feel free to check out more videos affiliated with this video by being part of the UNIMULTIVERSE archives.